Hi everybody, I'm Jack the Rambling Raconteur, and today is Tag Tuesday, so I'm doing the bread book tag Josh created from Literary Gladiators and tagged me in. I really enjoyed it, both the prompts and his video includes a lot of really interesting anecdotes around how he's come up with the questions around bread. So I really enjoyed it. I'll link it below. I highly recommend it. Let's jump in. Prompt 1, white bread. A work of 21st century genre fiction you can see studied in the years to come. I initially wanted to jump out right away and just say Harry Potter or Game of Thrones because they kind of are. Harry Potter already was when I was in college. A little over 10 years ago it was being studied, but the Harry Potter books that were included in that course were the ones published in the 90s. And I think if Game of Thrones, like the Song of Ice and Fire novels of George R. Martin, if those are, it will likely be the first book of Game of Thrones. They're not going to ask students to read 5 volumes. So, and Game of Thrones was published in the 90s as well. So when I thought about it, I thought, okay, let's think a little more open-minded about genre fiction. And I came up with the Fables, graphic novels created by Bill Willingham. And there's a number of different, Lan Medina does the pencils, Steve Leila and Craig Hamilton do the ink, Sherilyn Van Valkenburg does the colors, but Bill Willingham takes fairy tale characters and fairy tale stories and then he transports them to this land that exists in our time. This first book was published in 2002. There's a whole sequence and series. The Big Bad Wolf is the sheriff, Snow White is the mayor, things like that. But he gets into some really interesting aspects, such as if Pinocchio is make him a boy and he stays a boy forever, what does it mean if a character is stuck as an 8-year-old for hundreds of years? And it delves into that in some interesting ways. What does it mean when you have a character like the Big Bad Wolf who has been known to eat the other characters? How do you deal with that if he's reformed? And so I think I could see this being explored. Fairy tales have had sort of a critical renaissance, I think. I've got my Hans Christian Andersen fairy tales, Penguin Classics Deluxe, which famously has like the awesome paper cuts, not woodcuts that he did. So I could see Fables being studied. I enjoy it. Prompt 2. Whole Wheat, a work you feel reluctant to read but feel the need to at some point. That's hard for me because I'm pretty open to reading, or trying lots of things. I do try to read across genres. I mean, it always appears so, but I do try to. My wife recommends books, I'll read those. I recommend books to her, she'll try some of those. One that I'm interested in, and I'm either going to love it or I'm going to hate it, is Talk by Linda Rosenkrantz, which the entire book is just dialogue between characters. So it's pseudo avant-garde or experimental in that sense. I think it was written in the 60s. It's set in 1965, and it has sort of this just, everybody's too cool for school, everybody's just kind of a smart aleck, and there's just 3 characters talking to each other the whole time. And I'm either going to love it and think it's, very funny, or I'm going to just absolutely hate it. And so that's why. Prompt 3, Italian bread. A writer that can write in any genre or category. Not Girth. His novels are the worst. I say that as someone, of course, who's never written a novel, but I can't read them. He's somebody who writes across a number of genres, but not quite as many. I would say D.H. Lawrence. So I've got Women in Love, which is a novel that's pretty good. His short stories are very, very enjoyable. He also wrote novellas, or like longer stories that are enjoyable. He has some travel writing that I've found enjoyable. I've read some of his letters. D.H. Lawrence's politics and gender politics are not not something I agree with. But as a writer, he's a solid writer. His poetry is excellent and weirdly underrated. I think because of his prose fiction being so strong. But he's somebody who I think really just can just play any instrument. Even the instruments we don't like he can play them, or he plays in music on those instruments that we don't like, but he can play the instruments. Prompt 4, garlic bread. Doesn't everybody love garlic bread? Which genre or category would you argue has the most versatility and why? Science fiction. Science fiction because you can pretty much explore any idea. You can explore ideas that have never existed. You can explore current ideas and do that through the futurist lens. You can explore ideas from the past. And so I think science fiction just really works on so many different levels. As some examples, Hyperion is a science fiction novel that's a massive influence. Its massive influence is the Canterbury Tales. So we take Chaucer's Canterbury Tales and the Pilgrimage and put it in a science fiction universe where there's a shrike that, like, you know, a monster that can end people's lives. Morlock Knight is another one. This is K.W. Jeter. It's a sequel to The Time Machine, written like 80 years later, and it pulls in so many different ideas, and it looks back at Victorian times through the lens of sort of the 1970s and what post-war, you know, a generation after the war in Britain. The Female Man by Joanna Russ, which explores like feminist ideas within science fiction, but does it in a way that seems fairly natural. And so I would say Frankenstein by Mary Shelley. I know it's horror, but it's sort of a science fiction. Like they take things that are not possible at that time in, you know, early 1800s Europe, and they create this body, and then, you know, things happen with it. And even the way that it's sort of like set in the past, the science fiction, I think, can just pull and sort of explore whatever it wants to about human thought, which is great. Prompt 5, Pumpernickel. Not a fan. A work that was hard to digest. The Terror by David Andrus. I've talked about it before. It is the most stultifying book on the French Revolution you could imagine, which is sad, because the French Revolution, a very sad time in many ways, it is still influential today. I think some of the ideas, you know, ideas of extremism that still exist now in the 21st century were revealed in a large way in the modern world of the French Revolution. And it's disappointing. Prompt 6, rye bread. It doesn't say if it's Jewish or Russian or what type of rye. Rye bread. An overbearing perspective in a given work. The Fountainhead by Ayn Rand. And Ellsworth Toohey is overbearing and pain in the neck. But the long speeches Rand puts in, those are overbearing. They could have been shortened. They become repetitive, and we don't need to talk about, that's not even getting into some of the other issues that I have with that book. I can't deal with Atlas Shrugged, but the Fountainhead has some interesting ideas around art and architecture and like the purpose and the practicality within, you know, architecture, but the business around like seduction or what might be, you know, assault, no, that's an overbearing perspective. Prompt 7, sourdough bread. Yeah, especially a bread bowl. A writer whose works are usually cynical. Get him Upson. And even I think before he had the diagnosis of syphilis, and like his later work certainly reveals like a different sensibility, I think, in my mind than his earlier works. But even before that, I think in his earlier works, like in his first famous story, Ball of Fat, there's a deep cynicism about humans in that work. So he just runs through it. Prompt 8, banana bread, a character that made something out of a given situation. Janie Crawford from Zora Neale Hurston's Their Eyes Were Watching God. The idea of, you know, especially for a black female character in the South of that era, in the American South of that era, there's a lot going on in terms of, you know, beauty, in terms of work, in terms of being able to learn how to run a store, like, and sort of this idea of survival. How do you deal with a hurricane? How do you, you know, all of the, how do you interact with characters who are convinced that they're right and that you're wrong. Like there's so much in that book that fascinates me and that makes me return. And it's always that character that makes me return. Hurston's writing is incredible, but that character makes me return and want to explore her imagination and her psyche more. Prompt 9, Challah, a work of bread, a work, not a bread, a work that helped you develop a better understanding of Judaism. I'm going to go with the stories of Isaac Bashevis Singer. They're set for the many of his early stories and a good number of his later stories are set in the pre-war, pre-revolution Europe, where there's like the Jewish Pale in Russia, and they live in these small villages, and so many people are poor, they're just trying to work to survive. But it really gets into some aspects of Jewish culture that have still come down. Some of the more like spiritual and mystical aspects, the idea of characters throughout the stories are possessed or tempted, and what that means. We so often get that perspective from like a more the Christian half of Judeo-Christian sense, but his stories really dig into the more like provincial Jewish aspect, and they're fascinating and endlessly diverting. Prompt 10, Matzo, a work that reminds you about the importance of modesty. I don't know if it's Confucius's Analects, where he says, do not worry that others do not appreciate like your talents, worry that instead that you are not appreciating their talents, and plenty more. I mean, there's also, I dislike purple. I dislike purple because it displaced vermilion and stuff like that. But the other one that came to mind, and this is strange, but in Beyond the Black River with Robert E. Howard, we have the final line is, barbarism is the natural state of mankind, the borderer said, still staring somberly at the Cimmerian Conan. Civilization is unnatural. It is a whim of circumstance, and barbarism must always triumph. I disagree with that. But I think within the Conan stories, there's this sense of there's a time to be modest and a time to not be modest. There's a time to be, modest and make a choice to not do something foolhardy. But there's also time to not be modest and to stand your, work to fight for a better future when there's a necessity. So, prompt 11, Daily Bread. Yeah. A book that should be in every standard family household. I just went with one. Complete works of William Shakespeare. And I love the poems, I love the sonnets. I love the sonnets. The poems are okay. I love the plays. All genres. It's masterful. We have 2 copies. I have another copy, so we can do like readings in our house. Prompt 12, Baguette. 3 works that are perfect to dip in and out of. I grabbed 3. So I grabbed the Science Fiction Hall of Fame, which is a great set of stories. I'm not going to list all of them off, but so many good writers are represented in here. And what I like about these is they're very different, but it also works to kind of sit down and read a story. And then you can return days later, or weeks later, or months later, or 12 minutes later after you go, have a snack of bread, maybe a PB&J, and then, or go to the bathroom, and then come back and read another story, and it's delightful. I'm probably going to be doing something about A Rose for Ecclesiastes in the next week or so. Sort of Mars Midrash colliding. Emerson's essays. Again, these almost have to be read, like dipped in and out of, because sometimes there's someone's comment about it's kind of like chewing barbed wire aspects of it. But his essays are very thought-provoking, even when you disagree with them. I think it's important to read works you'll disagree with or agree with, and just explore so many different aspects of thought. And then, again, another type of work that I think almost has to be like dipped in and out of is any really strong poet, but to my mind, Anna Akhmatova, a great Russian poet from the 20th century. And this is her complete poem. So this is 900 pages of poetry. You're not going to sit and read this in one setting. It would be foolish to do that. But it works to sit and read a poem, just read one or read 2 or 3 and kind of reflect on those and then return at a different time and read them. So I think a lot of anthologies work that way. Those are the works that I dip in and out of, or really, really, really long works. Prompt 13, the Olive Garden breadstick, and hopefully they're unlimited. An unexpectedly great book you read this year. I've read a number of new books, or like books that were new to me this year, and I enjoyed many of them, but most of them I kind of knew, I acquired them because I knew I wanted to read them and I was going to love them. So I read GBH by Ted Lewis, but I knew I was going to love that book. I read The Metamorphoses by Ovid. I knew I was going to love that book. This is one that I kind of just acquired on a whim, and it was an NYRB Classics, Uncertain Glory by Joan Sales, and I just thought, like, I've never heard of this. I've never heard of this writer. It was set in the Spanish Civil War and has sort of like 3 perspectives running through it, and I was entranced. I loved it. I kept wanting to like find out more. It just transported me to that world, but showed me some different perspectives in that world in a really amazing way. Prompt 14, your favorite kind of bread. Rye bread. I like Russian rye, Jewish rye, marble rye. Last night we had patty melts actually, so it works. So that's my favorite like sandwich bread. But I also like pretzels, and I know how to make pretzels. There's a whole saltwater trick you can use. And they're tasty. Prompt 15, bread truck. Who do you tag? It's still we're still in a public health crisis where it's hard to tell who's doing these. So I'll just say that the bread truck has pulled around the corner, is on your street. If you want to go to the bread truck, go. If not, stay inside. Thanks, everybody.